for most Canadians looking from the outside in, they would recognize that we were in an ethical bind of bringing down the Liberal government and essentially handing over, a supermajority to the Pierre Poilievre conservative movement. The Poilievre opposition was spending like $10 million a quarter telling Canadians, and this is the dangerous part, Ryan, that I hope your viewers and listeners are tuning in on, telling Canadians that in a Canadian Westminster parliamentary system, cooperation is bad. Like, let's think about that for a moment. Carney has proven time and time again he's willing to set aside ethical considerations, international human rights, and our sovereignty for economic relationships. I'm not waiting for a superhero to come and save us from ourselves. Over the last several months, I've been actively engaged with former MPs, party activists, grassroots people, connecting on a renewal process to deliver, hopefully, some internal democracy, some reflection, some forethought into the future, because I don't believe that anybody's going to come and save us.
In the months since Mark Carney's been elected, we've seen the Liberal government act very much like a progressive Conservative government of old, cementing the Liberal shift to the center or maybe even center-right. Meanwhile, the Conservatives have doubled down on right-wing populism, and across the border, Zohran Mamdani became the mayor of New York, running on democratic socialist policies. And all of this has made me think about the opportunity that exists for the NDP as a truly left-wing party in Canada in the coming years. So to shed more light on this, I'm talking today to Matthew Green, who was a former NDP MP for Hamilton Centre from 2019 to 2025 and a union support strategist. Matthew, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's such a timely conversation.
Leading up to this last election, even before the trade war and Trudeau resigned, you had the Trudeau Liberals, who nobody liked, and the Poilievre-led Conservatives, which, as we've now seen, Poilievre is not a particularly popular leader. Yet the NDP in that time couldn't really make any gains or gain any ground. And of course, after the last election, ended up with just 7 seats. So in your opinion, what happened?
Well, as much as we like to think we're the main characters in the show, that certainly was not the case. We were, in a lot of ways, along for the ride. We had the opportunity with 25 members, fourth party opposition, to collaborate in our Westminster system with the minority Liberal government under Justin Trudeau to deliver a plan for workers, a plan that was crafted, a policy that was crafted by support of, the Canadian Labour Congress, delivering dental care, delivering promises of pharmacare, although that never really materialized. And of course, anti-scab legislation, a suite of policies that the labor movement has been fighting for generations. And we were able to work and deliver on that. And towards the end of that mandate, we had a choice. We had a choice in 2024 to pull the plug on a deeply unpopular Justin Trudeau, as you identified. I think it was pretty clear to all those watching that we had gotten as much out of the deal as we could get out of. And then it just came down to what the timing would look like. There were lots of conversations to be had. I won't get into the specifics of our caucus discussions. They're private, but I will say that for most Canadians looking from the outside in, they would recognize that we were in an ethical bind of bringing down the Liberal government and essentially handing over, a supermajority to the Pierre Poilievre conservative movement, which, as you identified, is about as far right as it has been in the history of the party, as kind of a mutation of the Reform Harper crew. These are the boys in short pants who get in as staffers and have worked their way to the top. Pierre Poilievre has been practicing his PM speeches in the mirror since he was 12. A very dangerous moment for Canada and a big opportunity for the NDP, one in which, as history would note, we did not seize upon. We rode it out and were essentially annihilated because of it. So ethically, I'm glad and I'm happy that we don't have a far right government. But what ended up happening in this time of contradictions is the Trump effect, this kind of black swan effect, delivered another Conservative party under Mark Carney in a way that, will still have major impacts on communities like mine and working class people across the country.
Yeah, you identified something that I have personally felt very conflicted about, which is the way that the public perception responded to the NDP collaboration with the Liberals. Because as you mentioned, the NDP, through that collaboration, were able to deliver on a number of promises or party priorities that they had been fighting for a long time. And to me, I always felt like that collaboration was extremely productive for the NDP as a smaller party. But the public perception, I think, and that's one of the challenges of a democracy, really, is that you can't control sometimes how the public perceives something. And even though as a party, you're accomplishing what you want to accomplish, I think a lot of people felt at the end of that collaboration that the NDP was complicit in propping up this Trudeau government that everyone was really mad at. And so I wonder how you balance those things between accomplishing what you want to accomplish as a party who is not in power, and also being aware of the messaging and the public perception and how that might influence voters going into another election.
Well, I would argue a counterpoint. I would argue that, in fact, you can, as a political party, effectively define the terms of, the political landscape. We watched the Conservatives do that. Rachel Curran is the former director for Harper's regime, is now a senior person at Meta. The Poilievre opposition was spending like $10 million a quarter, telling Canadians, and this is the dangerous part, Ryan, that I hope your viewers and listeners are tuning in on, telling Canadians that in a Canadian Westminster parliamentary system, cooperation is bad. Like, let's think about that for a moment. In a Westminster parliamentary system, Canadians, and the sentiment was, the message, the narrative, the $10 million a quarter spent on Facebook and Twitter and all these other places, was that parties who cooperate are somehow anti-democratic. That's how twisted we are in this moment of political understanding. I believe that opposition parties have three responsibilities. Yes, we are oppositional. We want to defend, and oppose, defend against and oppose policies that we think will hurt our constituents, right? We want to hold the government accountable. We absolutely want to do that. But we also need to be propositional. And being propositional, like we were with the CAS agreement, allows the democratic will of those, people who voted for the NDP to have policy passed in Parliament. And lastly, yes, when there are scenarios that other parties put forward legislation that we believe is good, we should support it. We shouldn't be so dogmatic and ideological and partisan, not even ideological, but partisan, where the idea of, from every now and again, supporting another party, and I say another party, Ryan, because we didn't just support Liberals in that session. There were times when we supported Conservative motions and legislation. There were times when we supported Bloc Québécois, legislation. So, I think the threat that we're under in terms of the fragility of our democracy is succumbing to this narrative that parties can't cooperate, and to somehow do so is anti-democratic. That's what we're up against. I believe it's mostly because of our proximity to the congressional system and a fundamental lack of understanding for how Parliament works. People came to me during the election. I went to them on the doors and they said, we love you, Matt. You've done great work. We appreciate you. We like the party and what it's done. But I need to vote for Mark Carney to stop Donald Trump. And I said to them, Mark Carney's not on the ballot. This is not an American presidential race. This is not a congressional race. You can have a scenario where you have working class voices elected and a liberal minority government, as we've done for 6 years. So that is the malaise that we're in, I think, is a vast misunderstanding or misread of what democracy means and how our parliamentary system works. And I think it is going to be a ginormous challenge for us to climb out of that and to be able to present as a compelling alternative for the future of the country, even if it means we don't form government. And I think that's the challenge.
You touched on a couple things there. I think it's been kind of funny seeing the Conservatives simultaneously say that the Liberals are stealing all their ideas and also be blanketed against everything the Liberals are doing, regardless of what it is, even though really the Liberals and Conservatives right now agree on a lot of things. But I think that leads to, if we look back at 2015, one of Trudeau's big promises was electoral reform. And of course, that didn't end up happening. And I think with the NDP, strategic voting is such a big thing. I think a lot of people in Canada do identify with the NDP, but feel like, in this last election, for example, I have to vote for Carney because it's the only way to stop Poilievre, to stop Trump, even if you really identify with what the NDP stands for. So does the NDP, in your opinion, have a path towards forming government without reform of our electoral system to proportional representation or something like that?
Likely not. I say it's not probable. It's possible. Anything's possible. That's one thing I definitely learned on the rebirth of the Liberal Party. Absolutely anything is possible. Within weeks, within months, things can happen. I'm not waiting for the ghost of Jack Layton to return and deliver us an orange wave. I don't know that that's probable. I think what's probably going to happen is a continuation of similar results that we've had in the past on these cycles of, Liberal, Tory kind of same old story where, the system is absolutely set up to favor the ruling class. We have two ruling class parties. We now have, Wall Street's guy, not even Bay Street's guy, but we have Wall Street's guy leading our country into deep austerity, into international trade and economic development at the cost of human rights and basic ethics. And they do it with this ratchet effect in that the further the Conservative Party goes, the further the Liberal Party can go. And, I think where we have an opportunity, if any, to get a foothold back into relevance is to follow that moment and offer an alternative. It has to be clear. It has to be compelling. It has to be in the material interest of working class people, communicated in a way that anybody can understand. And I don't think that's going to look like us on an orange wave. I think it's going to look like us getting that 25 to 40 seats, getting into a minority, and then forcing the issue off the bat on electoral reform. I've written extensively about Justin Trudeau's great big fat lie. It wasn't that he changed his mind. He never intended to deliver a true and meaningful process that would deliver, the citizens' choice of what they wanted, which was a mixed member representative system. He wanted ranked balloting because he knew that Liberals don't have a core ideology outside of, neoliberalism, and they can present and campaign in whatever way they want and be the second choice. But I think we are in a time of deep division and contrast and contradiction. And I think that the Mamdani, example that's been referenced is not just, in that New York example, but across the board, a way in which working class people can finally see their material interest represented in policy.
I feel like Jack Layton has become this sort of mythical figure ever since that orange wave. It's like, well, if only Jack Layton was here, we would have won, or we would have formed government, or we would have been the official opposition for years to come. And I'm not saying that's not true, but do you think that Jack Layton's passing has sort of become a scapegoat for other things or a way to justify things that haven't happened in the NDP?
Well, I think like all things, anybody who's around a winning team wants the attribution after the win happens. And I think that, Jack Layton was a generational leader. And we are now in a new generation that requires a different type of leadership. And I don't mean that to like personalize it about Jack. I mean, the approach is that there's never going to be a Le Bon Jack again. The moment that they had on Tout Parlement where he captured Quebec, remember, we got most of our gains in Quebec at a moment when the Bloc was completely in disarray, completely in the wilderness, and the Liberal Party collapsed. Those preconditions don't exist anymore. We don't have the per vote subsidies. We don't have union donations. We don't have union book-offs. We have to find another way. And there are still some people who were around when he was around and involved in that campaign who I think are trying to recreate that. And I think, in a lot of ways, they tried to do that with Jagmeet, and it just doesn't work anymore. We're in a very different moment that requires, I think, a different type of strategy.
So what do you think that strategy is?
Well, I think being unapologetically principled. I think not trying to compromise ourselves to find the perfect, weak, liberal light middle, and to stand for something. It's been my experience, even though I lost. So again, I'm not I'm not overstating my value here, but in the moments that I've been able to cross over into people who might have identified as conservative or longtime corporate liberals. I did it when I took positions that weren't popular in the moment. And people later came and said to me, I didn't agree with you, but I appreciated that you had the courage to take the position that you had. And we need to have more of that courage. And I think we've seen glimpses of that within our party. But this notion that people vote NDP because they think we're going to form government, I think is wrong. I think people vote NDP because they want somebody who's going to go to Ottawa to fight like hell for them and hold people accountable. And so when we let go of trying to form power in one fell swoop and recognize it's going to be an incremental win where we not just focus on one person, but on a whole caucus of incredible MPs who will represent their community. I think if anything's been lost in Canadian democracy, it's the idea, not just like on the first past the post side, but once people are actually elected, that MPs were originally defined to, represent their local community to the capital. Now, under this hyper-partisan culture, the demand is that MPs represent their partisan party interest from the capital back to their communities. And I think that's where we've lost our way. So I think that we should be able to have a deliberative democracy that engages people in tough discussions, that acknowledges we may not even agree as members within a caucus. That should still be okay. This idea that there has to be 100%, party line on every single vote was not the way the Westminster parliamentary system was designed.
Yeah, you talk about some things there that I fully agree with, having disagreements within the party, having these conversations and coming to informed decisions, having individual MPs be individuals who are representing their constituents specifically rather than just following party lines. But I wonder, does that get more complicated, or has that gotten more complicated as social media has amplified all of this misinformation and ideas like that? When you were going door to door, did you consistently encounter misinformation and things like that had been shared online?
Oh, absolutely. We are in a post-truth reality. And I think, the anti-vax COVID movement just demonstrated the way in which foreign actors, I'm not like this was a studied thing. We're seeing it right now on Twitter, right? Or X, when they added that feature that allowed people to see where the origins were of these accounts. We are flooded and bombarded with troll farming, bot farming and troll armies. And people have a very difficult time distinguishing who they're interacting with, what information is true, while simultaneously far-right populism has consistently attacked and tried to dismantle, mainstream media and our democratic institutions. And so there's a deep cynicism because people are suffering, and there's a need to try to make sense of the world. And so where people aren't able to make sense of the world, they're relying on, just complete fabrications of the truth. And I would say the Conservative Party has played an active role in fanning that in the way in which they communicate what happens in Parliament and why it happens. Pierre Poilievre has been there for over 20 years. He knows how the standing orders work. He understands how Parliament works. And yet day in and day out, he unapologetically stands up, bastardizes the truth to get the clip, and then pushes out just a farm of lies to his constituency, to his base, that I think, depends on and relies on, or at least assumes a certain amount of stupidity out of the people that are actually consuming the stuff that they're putting out there.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most frustrating things that I see in politics is when a politician says something that that they know is not true, because even a little bit of research shows that it is objectively false, but they're saying it for the clip. And I think people still want to trust their politicians, especially if they identify with them. And so that just contributes to the dissemination of misinformation. But moving on a little bit. So we talked about Jack Layton. The NDP is in the midst of a leadership race right now. What are your thoughts about that? Or, how do you feel that there are candidates that could turn the party around, or what do you think the results of that are going to be?
I'm not waiting for a superhero to come and save us from ourselves. I've, over the last several months, I've been actively engaged with former MPs, party activists, grassroots people, connecting on a renewal process to deliver hopefully some internal democracy, some reflection, some forethought into the future. Because I don't believe that anybody's going to come and save us. I think they're all wonderful people. All the registered candidates I've known or got to know, I think they add something to the party. I think that leadership races are a great opportunity to grow our base, to get out into the nooks and crannies of Canada and try to excite people. But I don't think 5 individuals have the ability to do that in the way that's required for us to gain relevancy, which is why I think, again, rejecting this mythology of the charismatic leader and really having faith in rank and file members to be able to organize in their own communities for the long run, not just for the next snap election or even the next 4 years election. I'm talking about thinking about what the next 10 years look like and meaningfully engaging with people door to door, street to street, neighborhood to neighborhood. I will say the party made, in my estimation, when I say the party, the leadership in the elected positions and employed positions of the party made a mistake in creating such a high barrier for the financial entry. We're coming up on a deadline. It might be the case that not all candidates make it past that deadline. And I think that the leadership race will be less because of it. And there's also a contradiction that says, in theory, I could apply to run for leader right up until December, having missed all of those previous deadlines and jump the line and jump right in. Whereas somebody who committed back in September, but may not have been able to raise the money come November would be disqualified. I don't think that that's fair procedurally or ethically or otherwise. And so, I'd like to see the registered candidates be able to complete this race in a way that brings all the ideas from the rural North, Indigenous perspectives, the prairies and otherwise. And so, we have an opportunity. I don't think we made the most of it, but I think the people who are involved are doing their best to make the most of it.
Yeah, I saw a clip. Rachel Gilmore did an interview with Tony McQuaid and Tennille Johnston where Tony offered to stop fundraising until Johnston had gotten over the $100,000 fundraising goal, which was a really nice moment, but also, kind of sobering and realizing that you need $100,000 to be in that race, which is not a small amount of money, especially if you're running a grassroots campaign. So it's an interesting barrier that they decided to put up, and I think it does sort of change who can be involved.
Yeah, if I have one reflection in the way in which we do politics, I think the NDP is at its best when we are building power in relation with our members and community and not in transaction with. Transaction with looks like ATM, looks like 5 emails a day saying, send your money, looks like only mobilizing during times of election. Relationship looks like showing up for people in between elections, showing up on picket lines, protests, rallies, being there to celebrate your community with your neighbors in your neighborhoods, and is inclusive in a way where people, when they become members, feel like they're actually a part of the culture, the decision making, and the outcome of the party, and not just an input that has to happen come election time.
Yeah, absolutely. So during this trade war with the U.S., there's been this shift. There's a renewed interest in pipelines. I think there's always pushback, but some groups of people are very excited about Carney's vision for Canada, and his vision comes with neoliberalism, deregulation, tax breaks for big corporations, things like that. That the typical free market solutions, and I think there's this idea that what the NDP stands for is for good times. So when the economy is great, yeah, let's have social services, let's boost the working class, let's have protections, let's have unions, let's have all of these different things. But when times are bad, we have to cut taxes and we have to attract foreign investment and we have to do all these different things. So from your perspective, for what the NDP stands for, how is that relevant at a time like this?
Well, I think I would have to begin, Ryan, by respectfully rejecting the premise of your framing and the question. I don't believe Canadians were excited about the budget. I think the approval ratings were like 30%. I think people are in such a crisis, they've been willing to defer to authority. And what capitalism has taught us is that the international celebrity of a banker, of somebody who comes from Wall Street, would inherently understand how business works. That is correct. Mark Carney is running the country like the CEO. He's doing it for the benefits of big business. And when it comes to this balance that I think we alluded to earlier, the balance between ethics and the economy, Carney has proven time and time again, he's willing to set aside ethical considerations, international human rights, and our sovereignty for economic relationships. And that's not hyperbole. He's reintroducing discussions with India and China. You know, we had a full commission, the Hague Commission on foreign interference that dealt with those two countries that has not been resolved. And yet he's willing to set that aside for the interests of mass corporations. The working class got nothing out of this budget. And what there's been, you know, only the liberals under Mark Carney could sell tax cuts as investment. And that's what they've done in this budget. And so I think it's going to take time, but I don't think Canadians are stupid. And I think they are going to see in these weeks and months ahead, particularly going into 2026, what deep austerity and shock doctrine look like. And we got nothing out of it in relationship to this guy who was supposed to save us from Donald Trump. He has conceded every single point that he purported to fight for. He dropped the retaliatory tariffs. We still have tariffs on steel. We still have no deal. There's been no deal made. And yet this guy that was supposed to have all this brilliance and expertise has only been, you know, publicly caught in conceding to Donald Trump in a way that, you know, would make Neville Chamberlain blush. And so that's like the cost of neoliberalism, is that it is absolutely going to impact people. But I think that people are in such deep crisis and struggle, they don't have the luxury of thinking through and fully understanding what international trade means. And so I think there's a willingness of the professional class, and even in some with the working class, to simply defer to authority. And I think the greatest mythology that capitalism has given us is the mythology that goes back to Margaret Thatcher, which is the one that there is no alternative, that people could imagine the end of the world through catastrophic climate change before they can imagine the end of capitalism. But it absolutely does not have to be that way. And I think that in times of reactionary moments, and that's what we're seeing the collapse of liberal democracies around the world and a rise of fascism in its wake. This is a historical prediction that has been, you know, presented by leftist theorists going back to Marx. And so it's predictable. We're in a reactionary moment. I think our time is going to be in the wake of the economic destruction that people like Mark Carney, the empty promises of liberalism, offer the Canadian public. So I think we need to be thinking deeply about what that alternative looked like. I think that, you know, if there's an indication, Mamdani is certainly one of those indicators, that people, including those that are in the belly of the beast of the imperial core of Wall Street, could elect a socialist. I think that there's an opportunity for us within these years to come to offer that compelling vision. If we stay committed to, you know, chasing the coattails of liberal light, third way, Blairite kind of politic, we're going to be doomed in the wilderness forever. And I don't think that we have to go out there and quote Das Kapital to deliver, you know, good policies for people. I think the average Canadian understands fairness. They know they're getting screwed at work. They know they're getting screwed by the banks. They know they're getting that their mortgage, when the interest rates go up and down, is literally taking food off their plates for their children. They know that it's unfair. The question is, who will they elect to actually confront those systems, which then require us going beyond the cult of personality politics that we've created in Canada, that allows us to personify the economy in these caricatures like Trudeau, like Carney, and like Poilievre.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I appreciate your perspective on that. It's interesting. I just did a video about the IMF and how the IMF does shock doctrine around the world and turns nations in the global south into nations that are primarily reliant on commodity exports, which is very fickle because commodity prices change all the time. And it's interesting right now with the nation building projects that are in Canada, there's not a lot of refineries or manufacturing. It's mostly on resource extraction. And so it's like Carney's vision is to turn Canada into the type of country that I was just looking at in this IMF video, a country that is almost entirely dependent on resource extraction and exports. So it's interesting that neoliberalism sort of has the same effects, just under a different framework in Canada.
I mean, there's lots of people there's lots of people that would argue that's always been Canada's project. Canada has always been three resource extraction raccoons in a trench coat masquerading as a sovereign state. When the whole, like, going back to beaver pelts, going back to, cod, like, we have always ripped and shipped to the benefit of everybody else. And again, the audacity and the cognitive dissonance of the public to accept any kind of narrative that building pipeline for an American company that will never truly benefit Canadians, funded by Canadians, is absurd. And I think that as they start to get into these numbers, when they see what $50 billion a year of military spending looks like for Raytheon, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, those are not Canadian jobs. And, we're getting mugged right now by a banker. And people aren't seeing that because of what is the very real threat of a fascist regime to the south. But I think that in these weeks and months to come, they're going to start to get closer and closer to that reality.
Yeah, I mean, Slisms, for example, is owned by Western LNG, an American company. It's going to be made in Korea with Chinese steel and then shipped over. And I think it's 250 jobs total out of it in Canada. So I'm not exactly sure how that's nation building, but it is on the list. So my last question, you've touched on this a couple of times, but if you had a magic wand and you could change a handful of things between now and the next federal election, what would you change in politics in Canada and for the NDP?
Oh, I would abolish first past the post and allow real democracy to happen where the will of the public, one person, one vote, is representative in the House of Commons. These false majorities where 38% of the population has 100% of the power is dangerous, because when you have the two ruling class parties, floating always at around 30%, that means they only need 8% to get 100% of the power. And that's where these deeply corrosive and divisive wedge politics come into play. The culture wars come into play. The scapegoating, vilification, of minorities come into play. And so I would remove that, and I would seek for a culture that actually encourages cooperation within democracy, so that the will of the public is represented in the House of Commons. And from there, I think a lot of the policies would take care of itself, because there wouldn't be this false dichotomy of Coke or Pepsi. People could have real choice. They could vote their conscience and not feel like their vote is being wasted. We have a structure that politically estranges people. I don't think people are apathetic. I think if people had a real stake in the decisions that were made, they would take advantage of that. But this structure has been set up by the ruling class since Confederation, specifically designed to protect the ruling class. And again, there is 1% of the population in Canada who has amassed $1 trillion in wealth. $1 trillion, Ryan. That is more than 80% of the country combined. That type of inequality is at its highest peak than at any other time in the history of Canada. So it's not that there isn't economic prosperity to be distributed. It's that it's being concentrated by these cartel families and this oligarchy that we have. And so, anything that we could do that would dismantle that kind of power and privilege, that would provide not just democracy within our political sphere, but also a shift towards democracy in our economies, which can only happen, of course, when we shift towards a cooperative economy that demands democracy within our workplaces.
Yeah, that's very well said. Is there anything that you want to add that you haven't touched on?
I just think that, forums like this are super important, and I'm encouraging people to challenge the frames that they're being fed, both in mainstream media and, of course, especially in the age of AI and deep fakes and what we're seeing in terms of these troll farms, these bot farms. Question things that you see online. If you're engaging with somebody in a chat comment section, they might not be real. And The best way that you can overcome that is by actually talking to people in real life. Have discussions with your neighbors and try to do it in a place that doesn't have judgment. Be open to people's material conditions and their interpretation of their material conditions, regardless of whether or not you agree with them, provided, of course, we're not talking about negotiating human rights or negotiating people's inherent worth on this planet. We're talking about, policies that would be impacting people's material conditions in the economy. So, yeah, I think that's it. And the more these discussions we have, hopefully, the more critical people can be of the political class. And only then, when there is that popular education and understanding, do people fully get the contradictions and hopefully begin to dismantle these systems that simply don't serve us.
Very well said. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for having this discussion. I really appreciate your input and your perspective on this political moment we're in and on the NDP and where the party might go in the future.
If you have the opportunity, I would encourage people to, yes, tune in to the leadership race that is happening, but more importantly, find your local riding association and get involved. And if you can't find your local riding association, feel free to reach out to me directly online or on social media, and I'll do my darndest to connect you to people on the ground in your community, because I do believe that, all democracy is local and we have to start there. So, there it is. Get involved, get active, and have your voice heard.
Thanks for watching this interview with Matthew Green. I hope you got something out of it. As always, please like, comment, and subscribe before you go. And a special thanks to everyone over at Patreon. If you want to support independent Canadian content like this, you can do so over at our Patreon page, which the link will be in the description. Thanks. I'll see you next time.